The Roman philosopher Seneca once wrote about how a candle or an oil lamp is an omen for an incoming storm because the flame will flicker as the weather changes. And that's on point for me at the moment, actually, because here in the capital of Paraguay, we are sitting at the edge of yet another minor cyclone. But Seneca contrasted the candle flame as a kind of omen with that of a comet being a herald of disaster, because the comet operates at a higher order logic that the humans can really only guess at or have a partial view of. What? And you know, during a tarot course that I taught years ago, I coined the term omen logic, which then escaped my clutches into the wild in a very pleasing way. And when you can combine what Seneca is getting at about the interconnectedness of all things, those signs and portents that are easy for the human mind to understand because it is the physical world communicating with each other, and those higher order ones that occasionally and with our partial understanding move through our reality. When you can combine what Seneca is talking about there with the alien logic and the high strangeness that attends synchronicity, then you get close to what I'm talking about with omen logic. And in the previous video in the Hospicing Modernity's Magic series, we looked at synchronicity. So we looked at the core term that was developed into Synchromysticism. And the thing about modernity, if you recall, is because it didn't allow magic to exist, it had to develop like a pseudo version of magic, which nevertheless sometimes worked according to magical principles, because what a shock, magic is real. And so in this video, we're going to have a little bit of a side quest into perhaps my favorite application of synchronicity or a magic of modernity into a more magic-friendly context. So we're going to look at Synchromysticism. And in particular, we're going to look at how getting better at Synchromysticism allows you to get better at magic. Now, why might that be so? Well, first of all, there's a sense of belonging, okay? I was gonna say, you finally realize you're not crazy. You might still be crazy, but you're in pretty good company. When you come to understand that, oh yeah, the cosmos is not just communicating with us, but more importantly, it's having its own conversation. And from that sense of belonging, there's a sense of rewilding, even, that you do belong in a cosmos that is awash in and even made of meaning. And then on the tertiary reason, or the tertiary why, is, yeah, you get better at prediction. But honestly, it's the third thing. It's third behind a sense of belonging and a sense of rewilding. But it certainly comes with it, especially as you build out a metaphysics to allow for Synchromysticism to work, and you come to a new appreciation and a new understanding of some of these techniques. So we should begin, obviously, I suppose, with a definition. What even am Synchromysticism? Well, friend of the show, Reverend Dr. Chris Knowles, most often describes it as the bleed over of dream logic into consensus reality, with the obvious implication there being that you can apply dream interpretation techniques to what you are witnessing in culture and in your life. Now, probably the best way to land this definition is with an example, and it's arguably the most famous synchromistic example, at least according to Jake Kotze. More about him in a minute, because he pioneered the term. And this is the famous story of the Millennium Hotel, the Hilton Millennium Hotel in downtown Manhattan on a certain day in September of 2001. Now, you'll recall, if you know this stuff, that the actual Hilton itself, the Millennium Hilton, was visually modeled on the monolith from 2001, A Space Odyssey. And then, of course, we have 2001 as the year that 9/11 happened. And you'll actually even see pictures and video where you have this monolith standing in front of like these buildings turning to dust, and planes or whatever flying into them. And then at the end you have rubble, and here is this monolith. that's a perfect example of how synchromysticism pulls in irrational, as in not of rationality, means of understanding an event, and even a non-conscious understanding. Because what have we got here? Then we've got Kubrick, so we have implications of hidden technology and people running the show from above that we can't necessarily see. That's in the story of Kubrick. But in the story of 2001: A Space Odyssey, we also have an act of violence associated with this monolith, providing a level up, for better or for worse, into a more technological way of being. Now, if you try to incorporate the development of the Millennium Hilton into whatever you think happened on 9/11, it's not going to work. It actually doesn't. You could be naive enough to think that the box cutters and Saudi's version of what happened is actually what happened. And you'd still be left with, so we have an alien monolith that leveled up in exactly the same way through an act of violence into a more technological, more surveilled, more patriot act, more violent and better at violence world. Millennium, 2001, A Space Odyssey, monolith, implications of high technology. That's dream logic. That's not the sequential logic. That's closer to what Seneca was talking about when he says that a comet as harbinger, a comet as omen operates at a higher order of logic to a candle. So let me give you a brief timeline, I suppose, a brief overview of synchromysticism as a subcultural movement. And we're sort of looking at 2006-ish. And in the first couple of years, it was things like 9/11. This is what Jake Coetzee calls like the capstone cabal model, where the early synchromystics were interrogating clues in popular culture, Super Bowls, and so on, as to what a concealed or occulted elite had planned. After a few years, it quickly became obvious that whilst, and we'll talk about this in a minute, whilst there certainly is, there's some emails that came out quite recently, for instance, there certainly is that layer that is doing its best to manipulate reality into directions that suit it. The sheer complexity and high strangeness, alien logic of what surfaces with synchromysticism means that not only is that not the only factor, it is a minor tributary. So in the middle there, according to Jake, there's like a one mind model. It's almost it's all consciousness man model. And on a recent interview, recent in the sense of I believe it was last year, on High Side Chats, Jake was talking about how he views synchronicity as a force like gravity, which is actually where Jung and Wolfgang Pauli got to as well, which is that it's some kind of force in the cosmos, like naturally occurring. And it might be, you know how I feel about Jung's attempts to science up something that I think should stay magical. But nevertheless, the point I'm trying to make is that it began as a capstone cabal clue spotting game. And it actually, most of its popularity came through that. And in fact, it's declined for a number of reasons in the last, decade or so. And one of them is just that it's just obvious that the more popular conspiratainment version of it just isn't right. So people who wanted that from synchromysticism, and only that, left dissatisfied. But I also think there's another thing going on, certainly in the last 10 or so years, which is that culture is fucked, okay? It's actually just unpleasant watching culture. But you can call it whatever you want, like woke mind virus or what have you, but the absolute destruction of the creative industries has pushed people onto platforms, Instagram, etc., and away from areas where we would previously engage with like rich symbolic material. And interestingly, one of the side effects of that, if you ask me, is that the the attempts at manipulation, which were always there in popular culture, they were just better at it, right? Because we watch more movies and so on. But like the CIA has multiple offices in Hollywood and so on, like the planning and message shaping that goes into culture. Now that culture is so fucked, it just looks obvious. It looks really clunky and crude now. So that you don't even need synchromysticism to try to like spot what maybe the Anglo-American elite have planned or which president they're going to select or any of that. You don't need to do it anymore because it's just like grimly obvious. When it turns out they want a particular president, they fake an assassination. Hi-yo! And I find that really fascinating. I find that really fascinating as something that happens in our fourth turning. That this stuff is actually more difficult because culture is worse. Culture is just garbage now. You will still find signs in the wild, which in fact is almost the point of this video. But that's the story of synchromysticism and where it's at now, and a good example of how it teaches you to stay in a state of Omen logic, Omen observation, and what medicine comes from doing that, rather than landing, and even if this turns out to be correct, rather than landing on a fixed singular answer. And before we leave the topic, I don't want you to think that I don't believe that there are occasionally some very skilled people who will essentially perform spells, will essentially perform mind control, which is to say spells on populations using the symbolic. The Queen was very good at that, for instance. And the other thing that happens at that level is a signaling to each other. And that's where you start to get repeated numbers like the 33s that are included in news stories that are essentially redundant. So I'm not suggesting that because culture is a medium through which the high strange communicates that we don't have that. It's really just to say that the people who tend to focus on that don't have a very good grasp of magic. And if you've actually looked at some of the whole like, oh, there's, the last Super Bowl was an occult ritual. Okay, what did it do? If it's a spell, what was it supposed to do? And that's where it all falls down. It's like the combination of symbols is indeed, combining symbols might as well be a reasonably good definition of spell work, right? So that's fine. What happens, like when I start combining these symbols, you can kind of infer the outcome. When you have like a lion and like a black and white tile floor or something in the Super Bowl, right, cool, I see it. What does it do? And that's, I think, the other thing from an analysis perspective that has led to synchromysticism's reduction in interest, because the conspiratainment folk went away, and the ones that were interested in the magic stuff actually weren't that interested in magic. They were still just interested in playing some sort of puzzle guessing game. So that's synchromysticism. What we need to do now is take a little trip back into synchronicity to refresh your memory, and also to pick up one or two extra little perspectives before we head over to Omen logic itself. Recall that Jung's final and, I guess, best definition of synchronicity is as an acausal connecting principle. And what I pointed out in the last video is that it only looks acausal to us down here in causality. We come back to Seneca and the comet, and there being a higher order and a higher logic outside of causality. The great American philosopher William James once wrote that we are like pets in the library, okay, in our master's library. Like we're in the presence of knowledge and a logic that is simply beyond our ken. And so it is an acausal connecting principle, but it is also an invitation to go, oh, there's probably a higher order above causality that is organizing it. And another way he said it was as a simultaneous occurrence of a certain psychic state with an event, either an external event or an internal event that, that is weighted with meaning. And that's one that interconnects quite well, that scissors quite well with Synchromysticism, because if you're looking at observing on an Omen logic basis external events, then those are the things that are going to resonate, acausally connect with your inner experience. And it was Jung's study of the I Ching that actually got him to this understanding, because what he observed with the I Ching, and I think this is one of the best things, I mean, I haven't read all the 6 wings or 7 wings or whatever it is in the original Chinese, in my defense, but he said that the I Ching wasn't so much a prediction device as it captured the quality of a moment of time, and captured more of the quality, the totality of the quality of moment, than something that in the West we would otherwise have been used to. And in that sense, one moment can carry the external event and the internal feeling. So what he found in the I Ching was that there is a framework of operating with the totality of a moment, and that it's not abnormal. It's not, oh, that's weird. I was just thinking of this and that happened. That's fully normalized via a platform like the I Ching. And in one of his Tavistock lectures, he says that, based on thinking with the I Ching, that things will happen together and behave as if they were fundamentally the same, but for us, they are not. So that a moment in time is fuller than we are allowed to consider it, certainly inside modernity, but even just in the West's understanding of a more linear beginning, middle, and end time. And that it's comprehensible and scalable, the I Ching teaches us this, if you behave according to its rules rather than expect it to behave according to yours. So that's the definition, and that's kind of where he got it from, like from basically time magic and understanding that, the West might have missed 70% of the totality of time of an actual moment, and that we consequently have words like synchronicity for when more of an event sneaks through. Now, in the last video, we spoke about what I think is, what people miss is psychoid archetypes. Towards the end of his life, talking about synchronicity and archetypes and so on, he developed the idea of the psychoid archetype, which is a structure or pattern in reality before it's split into the inner and outer. So it's at that comet level, okay? It's at that higher order logic. And Joseph Cambray, who was is a physicist and biologist in addition to being a Jungian, spoke about the psychoid imagination and how he observed that there are certain artists like Van Gogh that could somehow with their paintings capture a reality from optics. So certain qualities of light that we didn't know at Van Gogh's time that we now do, that is evident in his work. And so his suggestion or contention was that artists can capture more of the psychoid, dare we say the comet level. And so another good example of that would obviously be referencing back to the Millennium Hotel, Stanley Kubrick. Now, did Stanley Kubrick do some things for a level above official reality, for like a hidden hand, if you will? He certainly did. But he was also the second greatest, after David Lynch, the second greatest American filmmaker of the 20th century. And he wasn't told, as far as anyone was aware, oh, make the monolith look like this and have the bone and what have you. That came from him, and there's something about that at a level of psychoid, at a level of quality of moment, that then acausally will show up as the Hilton Millennium Hotel at Ground Zero. And that's not predicting, that's nothing linear, because it's acausal. It is capturing more of the totality of reality. And the thing is, whilst that's still good, whilst the idea that artists can capture, which I think is true, obviously, can capture more of the totality of a quality of moment, like an I Ching moment, gets more of that. It still leaves us with the situation of potentially too much agency given over to humans. And this is where I think magic, once again, like real magic done correctly, has the upper hand. And so I want to talk about Omen logic. Now, I have a friend, a Māori elder, Matawhero Lloyd, and once when I was leading a group over on his ancestral lands, Whetu Ariki, he told us about the Māori concept of wairua. Now, wairua literally in reo means like two streams coming together. Okay, so two rivers coming together. And when it's used, when it's deployed in this sense, it is the physical and spirit. So it is essentially following spirit. And in an embedded Maori context, that is following and living according to ancestral expectation and so on. But it's also when you follow wairua in a multi-day ceremony event like we were doing, you watch what happens and what spirit decides to do, and you basically co-create with that because you're one stream and the cosmos is another. And it's an open-ended way of just being present to what the universe is going to do, and then for us to respond in conjunction, like as a dance. And this is an excellent example of what I mean about the belief, I think accurately, that we're not the only game in town. And this the only game in townness is a hallmark of Enlightenment and modernity thinking, because we just kind of dismiss the spirit world, which basically just leaves us with us, because everything else is dead. Like, recall that it wasn't just Descartes, but his followers who are like, oh, the dog looks alive, but it's basically a meat robot. Like, it's actually just a collection of stimulus responses. And you think that's the height of sociopathy. And the West, so-called, wasn't ever like that until the Enlightenment and then modernity. If you think about something like a fairy troupe or the wild hunt or a fairy market, and different ways of building in and around Europe to accommodate spirit beings. We used to do it, and we used to have those experiences, but we had a framework of understanding that there are beings in the world who are off doing their own thing, and our lives will occasionally intersect. Now, in a Maori context, I think because they haven't been let me say this correctly, they've come out of the Christian bat hit faster than we have, right? But they've also retained more of the embedded and I guess spirit-aware logic of how the cosmos actually works. So it's more robust when we find it there. But you can look back in culture to understand that we had our own sense of Omen logic. And we should, because there's actually like a storied and fascinating history when you realize that it began, and I talk about this every time I talk about astrology, and how astrology for me is more Senecan. It's like total Omen logic. So it's the candle and the stars. The original forms of forecasting in Babylon were all the omens. Okay, so it was certainly comets and the movement of the wanderers and all the rest of the stuff happening in the sky, but it was plagues and it was crop yields, and the entire thing was read as a map of the communication and will and intention of the gods. And the ancient Greeks had quite an operationalized one. There's the difference between oracles and seers and a whole framework of understanding, so that by the time we get to Neoplatonism, we have the understanding that this whole thing down here is signs and relating. When you get into Christian Europe, let's say, that's carried on. Like, you actually have to unlearn significance. You have to be told that the thing that you've just seen that is awash in meaning doesn't mean anything. And we have this retained in culture up until we decided it wasn't true. I mean, I think about, like, famously in Hamlet, like horses eating each other as a sign. Well, that's probably not good. That's probably not a good thing for the kingdom. And we know that. You've seen things like, well, that's probably a sign. When I once saw, and this is crazy because corvids usually hold like funerals, but I saw once when I just moved back to Australia, a collection of crows in my hometown, like picking at the corpse of a dead crow. And I'm like, that's probably not good. Don't know what it was, but I'm like, And even if I tell you that, you're like, yeah, that's not on. That's not good. When you step into an understanding that you've had Omen logic taken from you, it's easy to get it back. Now, the metaphor I have been using for years when it comes to Omen logic, when it comes to Synchromysticism and so on, is like, I've just got back from the jungle. I've just got back from the Amazon. And the Amazon is the perfect place to talk about how everything is communicating, from every physically expressed organism to every spirit, to the humans, to the weather, to the rivers, to all of it. And it's all coming around. And obviously the job of the shaman is to interpret what is to be known for the tribe, right? And that includes, in more intact contexts, because you'll find, like, when you're in proper indigenous context, they'll co-sleep in like the one Maloka. It also includes sharing dreams, like in the morning, I had a dream about this, or I had a dream about that, and realizing that the whole cosmos is communicative, and it falls to us to find out what is ours in that communication. So what happens if you don't live in the Amazon in an indigenous context? What happens if you live in an urban, hypersaturated media context? Well, do you think the cosmos stops speaking to itself or stops speaking to each other? Now, obviously, you're not going to get as many jaguar spirits communicating, but the majority of stuff that happens at the level of the comet, right? Comet level, doesn't require those physical bodies. So the forces, the Neoplatonic forces that will present physically as things like jaguars will present as something else in your context. And I will even go further. Whilst it's better to have more jungle than less, there are means and opportunities to communicate for these beings in a media-saturated, hyper-modern context that are not available in even just a rural or agricultural context. So it is not simply the case that jungle is better and we have like a degraded version of it. That's true in a lot of sense, but not all of it. And the wider point that I want you to get to here is that actually, why would it not be, if it's communicating in the jungle, why would it not be communicating in St. Louis, right? Why would that not be in play? And so that's the case of why I think you should get good at Synchromysticism as a modern form of Omen logic. And it's also the first step, I would say, in how you do it, because it's a permissioning. You've had this taken from you, and it shouldn't have been taken from you. And there's a tremendous amount of power in just going like, I felt the meaning. We have the framework of understanding, synchronicity. I felt the meaning of that weird crow cannibal moment. Okay, that wasn't in my head. That was some kind of reality that we only have a partial understanding of. Yes, Omen logic is a thing. So permissioning is the first one. And the next is attending, is attention. Okay, so the philosopher Orland Bishop says that actually, as far as he can tell, attention is humans' only gift. Like everything else is borrowed and everything else is in flow, but attending. And we know this from synchronicity, that the more you become open to, the more of them you start to see. Now, why that's important for magic, of course, is that you can make the case, I would make a different one, but like you wouldn't fail the class if you said magic and synchronicity are identical. It is certainly true that magical results more often than not show up as synchronicities. So it somewhat behooves us to get good at what synchronicity really is, which is stepping into Omen logic, stepping into the totality of certain experiences. And these are the techniques, these noticings, these attendings that can help you do that. And that permissioning and attending brings what I told you at the beginning, which I think are the best things about this, is a sense of belonging and a sense of sense-making. Yes, the cosmos really is infinitely bigger than what your puny human senses can temporarily, for the time that you're in a body, attend to. And that, for me, is comforting. Like, as things get crazier, it's like, okay, cool, other stuff is going on. Now, there are a few things you will need to get better at getting better at Omen logic. The first is call it a home archetypal language. And for that, I would recommend astrology. But one way or the other, you need like a home symbol set, a home archetype set that is rich and deep enough to be able to play with this. It would also be worthwhile to brush up on your Joseph Campbell from a comparative mythology perspective. And, I mean, you can do comparative mythology a bunch of ways, but he was, according to a lot of people, like Jung's best student that he didn't actually have. You know what I mean? Like someone who actually really understood what Jung was getting at. So you need an archetypal symbol set to call your own. You also need an oracle built for Omen logic. I obviously prefer the I Ching for this. And it's nice that it has the connection with Jung to go with it, but it need not be the I Ching. Geomancy, because it's quite similar, is very good at this. So what you don't want is, especially if you're like a little bit inexperienced with cards, you don't want tarot necessarily, because it, in the, dare we say, the wrong hands, can be quite static from a meaning perspective. You need something that speaks the language of Omen logic, which is a little bit more oracular. So some oracle card decks might be good for that. But generally, I would suggest going with whichever one you vibe with, like a geomancy or I Ching. You also need to, how do I say this? Cultivate non-reactivity. Okay, so meditation's quite good. But one of the things that's plainly happening at the synchromystic level, and it's why it can easily be confused with, oh, this is a plot from like the Capstone Cabal, and sometimes it is. The use of symbols is frequently horrible. Okay, so it frequently involves violence and numbers and so on. And at least part of whoever's behind this, from like a spirit perspective and Capstone Cabal, I don't care, at least part of what they're doing with it is to farm you for loosh, okay? So if you're going to head, and this is just the reality of the spirit world, you will find entities when you're in ayahuasca ceremony that are waiting outside the energetic protections that are put up by your shaman to feed on you. This is just what it is to be in an ecosystem like the spirit world. So you're going to want some method of non-reactivity, because as you get skilled in Omen logic and observing the language of patterns of things that happen typically with national and international disasters, they are designed, at least in part, one of the things they're definitely meant to do is to cause you to react. So don't, right? And you see how these two go together. You see how, oh, this is some kind of op. And we can say op like spirit op, combination spirit plus cabal, whatever, however you want to say it. Oh, I'm not fucking with that. You don't get my energy. I'm gonna analyze it. I'm gonna Omen logic that, but you don't get my energy. Okay, so obviously, literally mindfulness meditation is fine. If you do the Foundations course in the membership, you learn about coming to your senses, which I think is the absolute best method for cultivating that awareness combined with non-reactivity. And finally, if you are going to go deep on your own clue questing, you're absolutely going to need Knowles criteria. And we talk about that on the episode of the podcast, which I'll have linked up below, where Chris comes to talk about his Synchromysticism manual, right? And so obviously get the book, listen to the show, and have a criteria for sense making so that you don't go crazy. You'll end up with your own. You might be more astrologically inclined than Chris or what have you. It doesn't matter. It's like, just make sure that you have a collection of criteria that allows for you to not succumb too often, it'll be inevitable, and it is inevitable with any kind of forecasting, pareidolia, okay? So you need some kind of retention of human logic, right? As you step into, or step more fully into the world of Omen logic. Side quest complete, and for the premium members, there's actually a 90-minute example training that is available for you in the app. And if anyone else would like to upskill on the I Ching, or even turn a little bit fucking pro with Omen logic, we have a full time magic course, an enormous time magic course in the app as well. So all of those things are available if you join as a premium member, and otherwise enjoy the extra resources below.